Kay from Crafting with Kay. How are we all doing? So welcome to my new segment called The Reading Nook. I reached out to an excellent author called Sharon Hannaford, and she gladly gave me permission to read her Hellcat series to you. She's one of my top 2 favourite authors of all time. I have a couple of mugs, so fill up a cup and drink, and yeah, join us for the project. So, what perfect diamond painting to use? The little dragon reading a book, drinking a drink, cozying up for the night, ready to breathe for the evening. So yeah, grab a project, grab a drink, and yeah, listen along. Just a heads up, I'm not the best at reading out loud, so I will probably butcher some names, but please, I will get there in the end. Either way, I hope you enjoy this new segment. Take care, guys. Enjoy! Chapter 3. Gabby felt the air around them grow bitingly cold as a thick, throat-clogging mist roiled up from the ground. The 5 hunters stopped just on the other side of the fence, fanning out in a defensive line. The 5 offensive Magi hovered slightly behind them. Even though they were standing over 100 metres from the place where the roiling mist was bubbling out from the earth, the cold was bone-numbing and the gag-inducing stench threatened to choke them. "All right," called Doug in his deep, urgent baritone. He was the most seasoned hunter among them, so the others deferred to him. "Let's see what comes out of that, then we'll split up amongst ourselves." He turned to the Magi. "Banishers and trackers, you can pick up any that get away from us, but stay behind us as much as possible. We're relying on you to send back any we can't kill outright. Give us a chance to strike a death blow first, but the priority is to keep them from leaving the area. The clean-up teams will have orders to follow any that escape us at a safe distance, and we'll catch up to them once the rest are destroyed. Don't be tempted to attack any that escape on your own. Don't forget how easily these things can poison you. Wait for backup and do not engage one alone. Am I clear on that?" He roared like an army sergeant. Gabby had to bite her lip to stop herself saluting and yelling, "Sir, your staff sergeant, sir." Doug would not be amused. The Magi murmured agreement and moved apart into a loose line, their expressions calm and resolute as they began their own internal preparations for the battle. Gabby was quietly cursing the fact that she'd run out of sweets, and took to pacing in a small circle as she tugged on a pair of fingerless gloves. Lance was playing idly with a small ball of fire, tossing it casually from one hand to the other, while Carl was rechecking his weapons, and Matt was stretching out muscles and grinned with a grin of anticipation on his rough, unshaven face. Gabby suddenly became aware of another change in the air. An electrical charge seemed to crackle angrily across her skin, and a thick, oily darkness descended into her brain. She quickly looked around at Carl and the others. They were looking uncomfortable too. She had a quick, hissed intake of breath from the group behind her. The demons had made it across the void. "Buckle up, boys," Gabby drawled loudly. "Time to kick some fucking demon ass!" Her last words came out as a scream of defiance. A snarl broke from deep in her throat as she ripped necks from her sheath, a look of vicious determination on her face. The darkness swamping her brain immediately dissipated, and her outcry seemed to have the same effect on everyone around her, as they all drew weapons and issued war cries of their own. The demons emerged from the mist, a motley group of repulsive aberrations from the darkest depths of hell. 4 grotesque creatures lumbered into sight, and the group collectively breathed a sigh of relief. The relief was short-lived, as another smaller demon flew out of the fog and hovered a few feet above the others, and then another wraith-like being floated out to the right of the gathered horde. The hunters froze in tense expectation, wondering what exactly they were putting themselves against, and how many more were coming. "That's all of them," a small, hushed female voice said from just behind Gabby. "The portal is closed. No one can cross tonight." "You sure?" Doug demanded from the slightly built Magus. "Positive," she squeaked. "Trinity knows what she's talking about when it comes to portals," one of the male Magi quickly backed her up. "Okay then, let's see what we have to deal with." The demons had started to get their bearings, and the wraith-like one raised a tattered sleeve and pointed towards the groups of hunters, standing ready and waiting. The wraith was wearing a heavy dark cloak that covered its entire body, if it even had a body. Nothing could be seen except for glowing yellow-green orbs floating in the depths of the cowl. Matt, the tall, heavily muscled werewolf, was the first to stake his claim. "I'll take the skinny green giant," he said, referring to the tallest of the demons. It was over 8 feet tall and covered in bits of leather armor, which sprouted vicious metal spikes. Its skeletal arms and legs were covered in flaky pea-green skin, and its hands ended in 3-inch dagger-like claws, dripping with a dark, oily substance that hissed and splattered when it came to contact with the grass at his feet. It turned its human-shaped head to look at them, and Gabby realised it had no discernible mouth, and only holes for nostrils. 3 large eyes, completely black, situated just below the ridge of the brow, with dark green spikes protruding from its forehead. "You're welcome to that one," countered Lance. "I think I'll take Godzilla over there. Weapons aren't going to pierce its armoured skin easily, so let's see how it takes to being slow roasted inside its shell." He finished with an evil smirk. This demon was so tall and hulking, though not as tall as the first one. Straight out of a B-grade monster movie, it was mostly reptilian in its appearance. Though standing upright on thickly muscled legs, it was covered in large metallic scales all the way down its massive tail, which was easily as long as Gabby was tall. Its gaping jaws were more like those of a crocodile and filled with thousands of razor-sharp teeth, which oozed with slimy black saliva. Doug interrupted quickly as Gabby and Carl started to claim their targets. "I'll take the Birdman," he said, jerking his head up towards the slick, thin avian demon, hovering in mid-air. It had motley yellow and brown skin and no feathers, but leathery bat-like wings that were far larger than the rest of its emaciated body. It had scrawny human arms and legs, but instead of a mouth, it sported a vicious-looking hooked beak, sprouting from its humanoid face. It was carrying a crudely fashioned crossbow. "I can change into something with wings to chase it down if it tries to run." "You'll need to watch out for that crossbow," Lance cautioned. "If I get a chance, I'll try to set fire to it." "Okay, but don't lose your concentration on Godzilla." Then Doug steeled himself. Gabby wasn't going to like what he was about to decree. He drew a deep breath. "Hellcat?" Yeah, I know," she interrupted with the annoying sigh. "I get the short one." The shortest one of the bunch was around Gabby's height, or a little shorter. It was squat and heavily muscled, with huge, hairy feet, with long, coarse fur sprouting out all over its body and head, including its face. It flashed a macabre grin, bearing rows of needle-sharp teeth from its overly large mouth. It carried an odd assortment of weapons, all medieval in nature. Maces, clubs, spears, and battle-axes. Gabby knew it made sense that she took on the one closest in her size. The men would have to change their fighting style to accommodate the difference in height. There was no room for any egos in a fight like this one. "But once I'm finished with Shorty, I get to go after the Wraith," she declared triumphantly. "I think we'll all have to go after the Wraith," Doug declared, but didn't bother warning Gabby off. "Keep it busy till we can help you finish it off." "Well, I guess that leaves me with the brick shithouse," Carl said. The only unclaimed demon was a hugely built, 7-foot-tall creature with an extra pair of arms and several eyes placed a few inches apart and a ring around its head. It had no lips covering its shark-like teeth, and a wide, flat nose which flared as it sniffed the air. Metal armor covered its torso and legs, and it was holding 2 wooden war clubs and a spiked flail. It was definitely built like the proverbial brick shithouse. "Don't worry, Wolf," Gabby teased. "I'll rescue you if it gets too much for you to handle." Carl gave her a withering look. "They're advancing!" a voice called from behind them, dragging their attention back to the horde. The demons had spread out into a rough line and had begun moving towards them. The hunters also spread out, angling closer to their assigned targets, giving each other room to fight. The Magi moved back slightly and clustered together, touching each other lightly. Alone, they each had formidable powers. Connected, they could combine powers and become an astronomical force, which could withstand the strongest offensive magic and overcome the most stubborn defensive magic. They would watch closely and render assistance to the hunters when needed. Their magic couldn't kill demons, but could banish them back to the other world. Unfortunately, at times when the veil was thin, a banished demon could always return to the place it had been cast back from. It was best to kill them on this plane, so there was no chance of a revisit. Savage screams rent the air as the demon onslaught began. Gabby streaked towards her target quicker than any of the others. Next tasted demon blood before any of the other hunters had even engaged their targets. She'd drawn a butterfly sword as she ran. She knew she would be sacrificing this sword. Demon blood ate through any material it came in contact with, unless the metal was magically protected by a complex spell. Each hunter carried one protected sword or knife. Next was protected. The Chris had met with demon blood many times before and was impervious to the corrosiveness. The other sword would only draw blood once on a demon, but it would be enough if she could get it into the heart of the beast. As she darted in to take another chunk out of Shorty's upper arms and sidestepped to avoid the spurt of blood, she heard the others clash with their targets and smelt the distinct acrid smell of burning demon flesh. She ducked, narrowly avoiding a spear hurled with immense force straight towards her head. Pivoting around in a small semi-crouch, sprang forward, driving next directly into the demon's right eye. She danced backward, hissing as a drop of blood splattered on the side of her face. It burnt like molten lava, and she quickly wiped it off with the back of a gloved hand, then bent to wipe her glove on the grass before the blood ate a hole through the toughened leather. She dropped the butterfly sword that had started to disintegrate and grabbed another one out of a thigh sheath while the demon bellowed, lurching around uselessly with necks protruding from its eye. She started back towards the demon and, using every ounce of her considerable strength, drove the butterfly sword directly into the demon's chest, cutting downward to open its chest cavity and expose its internal organs. It started to collapse on the ground, grabbing at her with huge hairy hands as it did so, but she was as quick as a cobra. She ripped nicks from its eye, kicked the demon onto its back, dropped the other sword, and using both hands, plunged neck straight into its black pulsating heart. She leapt back as black gunge spewed from its chest cavity and stood watching as the body of the repulsive creature began to liquefy. Soon it would only be a puddle of foul-smelling acidic jelly. The clean-up crew would deal with the remnants of the demon later. She snatched necks out of the rancid mess, cursing as the demon blood seared her exposed fingers. She quickly wiped the blood off with a strip of cloth from her pocket and threw it onto the jellified remains. It was a hard-learnt trick of the trade to include scraps of tough cloth in your battle gear for times like this. She did a quick scan of the 4 other fights. Her blood was boiling with adrenaline, her breathing was quick and deep, her eyes bright and her face flushed with excitement. She revelled in the thrill of the fight. Lance had Godzilla careening around in agony, though its thrashing tail was posing a danger to anyone in the vicinity. The reptilian demon was too overcome with the internal fire to really try and cause Lance any damage. Demons typically didn't react to pain. They didn't seem to feel any. The exception to this rule was pain caused by fire, and Lance's fire in particular seemed to cause them agony. Doug had shifted into a form of an enormous condor and had ripped huge holes in the hide and wings of the Birdman demon. They were now circling each other warily, the crossbows lying blackened and smoking on the ground. Zippo was living up to his reputation today. Matt was still in human form, facing off against the thin green demon, so he obviously didn't feel too overpowered. Matt had the rare werewolf ability to change his wolf form in seconds. If he found himself outclassed as a human fighter, he simply retreated, ripped into his wolf form, and held back at the usually astounded attacker in a blur of teeth and claws. Carl was the only one looking like he could do with some help. The 4-armed demon was swinging the cruel-looking flail at an alarming speed, making it almost impossible for Carl to get anywhere near it. The demon's extra eyes made it difficult to rush it from any side, and even if he did get past the flail, there were 3 other foot-long war clubs to contend with. She knew he would be pissed at her later for intervening, but it was going to take more than one hunter to take this demon down. She was just heading in Carl's direction when she heard the Magi cry out in alarm. Shit, she thought. The Wraith! She skidded to a halt and cast about, seeking the ghostly demon, when an icy chill suddenly passed over her, freezing her in place. She knew instinctively that the Wraith was directly behind her. With a huge mental wrench, she freed her immobilized muscles and spun around to face the new threat. Now standing only a few feet from the demon, she could see that it had no substantial form. It seemed to be made up of smoke and fog, as though air particles had been condensed and moulded into a vaguely human shape. Spectral hands protruded from the ends of the ragged sleeves, but no feet or face were visible. Only glowing orbs suspended in the dark space of its cowl. It radiated pure, undiluted malevolence. Gabby didn't hesitate. She lunged directly at the creature, aiming next at the glowing orbs. As Nyx pierced the air inside the dark cowl, she felt a sharp jolt, like an electrical current. She felt herself picked up off the ground and flung backwards like a rag doll, landing in a crumpled heap several meters away. She lay on the ground stunned, gasping for her air. Her limbs were refusing to move. "Holy shit, Gabby!" Carl yelled, taking his eyes off the four-armed demon momentarily to assess Gabby's situation. It was a mistake. The spiked flail caught him across his left side, pounding into his ribs and gorging strips of flesh and muscle as it tore free. Agony ripped through him, and he stumbled backwards, falling onto his backside. Fall saved his head from being concaved by a huge war club that hurtled through the air, directly where his head had been only a millisecond before. He'd lost his main sword and was groping desperately for another weapon when his hand closed around the dart gun. The demon rushed him, drawing back the flail once more. Carl drew a gasping breath, steadied himself, and fired the dart gun 3 times into the beast's face. The demon tossed its head in agony at the bite of the darts, sending the flail down slightly off target. Carl managed to wrench his body aside, but the cruel spiked head of the weapon caught a glancing blow off his upper thigh, tearing through the leather and lacerating the flesh below. The wolf inside him howled in fury. It wasn't going to lie quietly and let him be flayed alive. The power of the wolf put him to his feet, forcing him to move his agonized body away from the crazed demon. It was floundering around, swiping at mid-air and roaring madly at the unseen attackers. The werewolf saliva was working through the demon's body. It would be incapacitated in seconds. Matt and Lance both streaked towards it and plunged knives and swords into it, finishing it off quickly and efficiently. "Gabby!" Carl yelled again, clamping his left arm down over the bloody gashes in his side and try and staunch the flow of blood. She was slowly picking herself up off the ground, but she seemed unsteady and confused. She was blinking her eyes wildly, rubbing them with her hands as the wraith moved menacingly towards her. "Shit, something's wrong with Gabby," he yelled to Matt and Lance. He started staggering painfully towards her, but then he felt Matt's steady hand suddenly grip his shoulders. "We've got her, Wolf. Just get yourself to medics," Matt ordered, and then sprinted after Lance towards Gabby and the wraith. Carl knew he wasn't going to be any help in the fight, but the wolf wouldn't let him just curl up and wait for the medics. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the way Gabby was reacting. Lance and Matt placed themselves between Gabby and the wraith, and Lance began tossing fireballs at it, aimed for the eyes inside the cowl. The Magi had moved closer to the fight as well and were gesturing wildly to the other hunters. Doug flew into the middle of the melee and changed back into human form, shouting at the Magi to start the banishment spell. Carl had managed to drag himself close enough to call to Gabby. "Gabby, are you alright?" he shouted anxiously. "Gabs, you need to get back from there. The others have got it under control." "I hope," he added under his breath. "Tell them not to touch it," Gabby yelled frantically. "They mustn't touch it." There was an edge of hysteria in her voice. She put her arm out towards him as though feeling for him, stumbling in his direction. It was in that instant he realised she was blind. Gabby felt the air whoosh out of her lungs as her back hit the ground with a bone-jarring crunch. The force had felt like a huge electrical charge exploding through her body. She lost track of time when her lungs remembered how to breathe. She groggily opened her eyes, but darkness still clouded her vision. She shook her head, trying to clear black fog from her eyes. Her limbs were shaking, and she didn't seem to have any control over them. "Holy cow," she muttered to herself. "What the hell is that thing?" In the distance, she heard Carl yell her name. She knew she had to get to her feet, but she knew she had to get back to her feet, had to clear the blackness from her eyes and prepare to face the wraith again. She could smell the dry, musty odour of it. It was coming for round 2, and she wasn't sure she had another round in her. How was she supposed to fight this thing? "Distract it until help arrives," she told herself sternly. "Get up." She fumbled around until her hand closed around Nyx's hilt, then managed to get to her feet and legs into some kind of order and dragged herself upright, swaying as she tried to lock her legs in place and take a confident stand. She wondered briefly if this is what it felt to be drunk, or stoned. Her metabolism burned through alcohol and drugs so fast that she'd never experienced either. Maybe she was blind drunk, she suddenly thought, inanely, almost letting out her hysterical giggle. She started rubbing furiously at her weeping eyes. They were burning and itchy. Nothing she did seemed to clear the black fog. She couldn't see anything, and she knew the wraith was edging around to her other side, hoping to take her unaware. But she had other senses to rely on. She concentrated on those and tried not to think too hard about the loss of her sight. She took a steadying breath and was about to turn and face the creature when she heard Carl call out to her again, asking if she was all right, telling her to move away and that the others were close enough to take over the fight. A surge of panic shot through her. They didn't know what this demon was capable of. She shouted at him to tell them not to touch it, but she wasn't sure they'd listened in the heat of battle. She reached out blindly towards Carl's voice and took a few steps in his direction. She could smell blood. Carl's blood. "They've got it under control," he repeated. "The Magi are almost done with the spell." At that moment, she felt his hand take her outstretched arm and guide her into a warm, reassuring hug. She collapsed into his chest, not saying anything as she took an unsteady breath and put her arms around his waist. He flinched involuntarily, grunting softly. She could feel warm, sticky wetness under her arm where it touched him. "Shit, Wolf!" she exclaimed. "You're badly hurt. I could smell the blood, but I didn't know it was this bad. We need to get you to the medics." She quickly sheathed necks and began pushing him in a direction, but then realised she didn't actually know which direction they needed to head in. The stench of demon blood and burnt demon flesh obscured the other odours around them, so she couldn't even smell where the clean-up teams were parked. Carl pulled her back to face him, put a finger under her chin and brought her face up towards him. "You can't see me, can you?" he asked softly. He was trying to keep the horror out of his voice, but it leaked through, and its presence sent a wave of icy cold fear cascading through her veins. She shook her head quickly, not trusting her own voice. He ran his thumbs over her eyelids and took her face in his hands. "We'll sort this out. Don't worry. It's probably something magic-related. The Magi will know what to do." He sounded like he was babbling, trying to mask his fear for her. She cleared her throat. "Yeah, of course they will," she agreed in a cheery, business-like voice. "It's just a temporary thing. My body's still feeling the effects of the zap too. It'll probably just wear off." She wasn't sure if it was him or herself that she was trying to convince, but the bravado was better than collapsing in hysterics. She tried not to think too deeply about what the permanent loss of her eyesight would mean. "Now," she continued with false air of cheerfulness, "point me in the right direction and we'll get you to the medics." She turned his body so that she was supporting him on the uninjured side. "Can you walk, or do you need me to carry you?" she asked snidely. He chuckled lightly, then groaned, grabbing his torn side. "Don't make me laugh, Hellcat. I think I cracked some ribs," he complained. "That'll teach you to take your eyes off a demon with 4 arms," she said without sympathy. They had just begun their slow, painful hobble back towards the parking area, where an enormous wave of elemental power crashed into them, sending them both to their knees. Deafening roar, followed by a gale-like rushing air, signalled the end of the spell and the return of the wraith to the other world. There was an excited hum as everyone gathered in the parking lot, mostly standing in small groups or near the medical van. Gabby was sitting on the rear tailgate of one of the clean-up vans, while Melinda, a healer Magus, applied a salve to the burns on her face and hands. She could hear Carl a short distance away hissing as they patched him up. She could tell by the sharp intake of Harry's breath that whatever injury Carl had sustained, it wasn't a pretty sight. Harry, even though a full human, was a seasoned vet at patching up hunters after a fight. If Harry thought it was bad, then it was really unpleasant. It was a good thing that Carl healed quickly. So quickly, in fact, it was a constant sore point between him and Gabby. Melinda told her calmly that she had already patched up some cuts and scrapes and burns on Doug. Nothing too serious, and the other 2 hunters had come out unscathed. Carl was by far the worst off, but with his speedy healing, he would be good as new in a few days. She didn't say anything about Gabby's blindness. It was hanging over all of them like an oppressive cloud. Some of the clean-up crew had been sent off for coffee and food from a nearby gas station, and the rest were disposing of the demon remains using the specialised equipment Byron and the tech geeks had developed for exactly these situations. She could hear Doug and the Magi discussing the assortment of demons that had come through the veil. The wraith was the hot topic of the night, and there was some heated debate as to what kind of demon it was and why it seemed so powerful. It must be some kind of mix between a Chaitan and a Celebri, one of the male Magi theorised. You could be right, Christian, the female voice answered. The Chaitan is a traditional wraith type born of smoke and air, but I've never heard of one with the power to cause an electrical shock and blindness. The Shalbreri has the ability to cause blindness, but they are traditionally a solid form demon. This is something we've never encountered before. A combination of powers. She drifted off thoughtfully. The researchers are going to have their work cut out for them tomorrow, trying to make sense of this attack, came Christian's voice again. Nothing was normal about this attack. A different male voice chimed in. We need to start liaising with other groups around the world to see if anyone else has experienced this kind of deviation from the norm. What about that Birdman? This was the female again. Do you think it was Lanithro or an Arachula? This question sparked a whole new debate, and Gabby grew bored of listening. She tuned them out and cast about for something else to grab her attention. The tailgate sank down as someone joined her. Doug, she recognised his voice then. Coffee? He asked. She held out her bandaged hand wordlessly. A polystyrene cup was pressed into it. She brought it to her nose and breathed in the warm steam appreciatively. It wouldn't be the best coffee in the world, but at that moment in time it would taste fantastic. She wrapped her hand around it and took a tentative sip. I hear the Birdman took a few chunks out of you, she teased him. He ignored her attempt at deflection. I've spoken to Byron and Athena, he said carefully, referring to a young Magus that Gabby didn't particularly like. And what did the great and powerful Magus liaison have to say about my predicament? She asked savagely. The last person she wanted informed of her weakness was Athena. Doug sighed as though he'd known his statement would raise Gabby's hackles, but also knew he hadn't had a choice. They both knew the truth. Athena was one of the most powerful Magi in the city, and even Gabby realised that if her blindness was magically induced, Athena would be the best person to try and reverse the damage. She just didn't like to think of owing Athena anything. She is very concerned about you, as we all are, he ploughed on. Byron is obviously rather distressed as well. He wanted to come through and collect you immediately. He interrupted as she started to protest. I told him you would be fine with us for now, and you would call him if you wanted him to collect you. She could hear footsteps approaching them on the other side. Kyle. He silently sat down on her left side and put a comforting arm around her shoulder. Her tough ego self wanted to shake him off, put her practical inner self into and told her that she needed his solid familiarity to keep from going to pieces. Did they have any ideas on what to do for Gabby? Kyle's carefully neutral voice asked. Their recommendation is to wait at least 24 hours to see if the effects were off on their own. Gabby and Kyle both instantly started to protest. Yes, Doug cut them off loudly. I know it sounds really harsh, but their reasoning is sound. Athena feels that if they intervene unnecessarily, they might do more harm than good. If the blindness doesn't wear off on its own, then the risk of intervening are worth it. Waiting 24 hours is not going to make the situation any worse, and all going well, Gabby may not even have to let Athena into her mind and body to fix the problem. Doug quickly played his trump card. Gabby knew she had been painted into a corner. She capitulated with a growl and resorted to finishing her coffee without another word. Okay then, we'll do it that way, agreed Carl on her behalf. I'll get her home. Can you arrange for someone to collect her car and drop it at the house? Doug agreed, and after reminding Gabby to call Byron, he strode off, probably to chase everyone home. It had been a long night and dawn wasn't far off. They needed to be clear of the place before the first workers arrived in the area to start their shifts. Your place or mine, babe? Kyle teased her. Mine, she said tiredly. What time is it? Must get back and feed Razor and Slinky. It's just gone 4 a.m, Kyle answered. Would that explain the chill in the air, she thought. Then another more panicked thought rippled through her. Oh, shit! What? Kyle asked, instantly alarmed. I didn't leave any extra food out for Razor before I went out. He's gonna have wrecked the place. Tune in next week for more fun. Bye guys.